The greatest empire in history did not collapse in a day. We are about to drift through the centuries-long story of the fall of Rome, a gentle narration designed to soothe you into sleep. By the end, you will understand how a world of marble and legions faded not with a bang, but with a slow, weary sigh. We will trace the first quiet cracks in an age of gold and follow the distant echoes of an empire's final heartbeat. What does it feel like to watch a civilization unwind over hundreds of years? The Mediterranean world lay quiet under a blanket of profound peace. For nearly a century, from the rule of Nerva to the death of Marcus Aurelius, the empire experienced what historians would later call the era of the five good emperors. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, at its most brilliant and serene zenith. Imagine, if you will, a single, unified civilization stretching from the rainy hills of northern Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria. A citizen could, in theory, walk from one end of this world to the other on roads of impeccable stone, safe from bandits and protected by the distant, orderly presence of the legions. Trade flowed like water along these routes, carrying Spanish olive oil, Egyptian grain, and silk from the mysterious East into bustling ports and thriving cities. In the heart of it all was Rome itself, a city of gleaming white marble and red-tiled roofs, where the air hummed with the distant, comforting sounds of commerce and conversation from the Forum. The warmth of the sun was not just a climate but a feeling, a sense of security, of order, of a world that had finally been arranged correctly and would remain so forever. The frontiers were quiet, the provinces prosperous, and the emperor was seen not as a tyrant, but as a first among equals, a steward of this immense and tranquil garden. It was a golden afternoon for Western civilization, long and seemingly endless, but the very stillness of that afternoon, the very depth of that peace, makes what followed so haunting. For how does something so vast, so solid, so permanent begin to unravel? The answer starts not with a crash, but with a whisper, a faint chill in that warm Mediterranean air. That deep, golden peace could not last forever. The first real signs of strain appeared not at the edges, but at the very center of power. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in the year 180, the careful system of adopted heirs gave way to a son, Commodus, who was more interested in performing as a gladiator than governing an empire. This was a subtle but profound shift. The principle of selecting the best man for the job was replaced by the dangerous lottery of birth. And from that moment, the position of emperor became a prize to be seized, not a solemn duty to be inherited. What followed was a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a long, slow-motion unraveling that lasted for nearly 50 years. It was less a single catastrophe and more a series of weary sighs from a civilization beginning to groan under its own immense weight. Imagine the empire as a vast, intricate machine, its gears once oiled by stable leadership and sound currency. Now those gears began to grind. Emperors rose and fell with a dizzying speed. In just 5 decades, Rome saw more than 20 emperors claim the throne, and almost all of them met violent ends, assassinated by their own soldiers or rivals. The army, once the loyal guardian of the frontiers, became the kingmaker, realizing that the man who controlled the legions could demand the purple robe. This was political instability on a scale the empire had never known. It was a rhythm of chaos, a distant, rolling thunder on the horizon that never quite ceased. This political chaos bled directly into the economy. To pay the armies that kept them in power, these short-lived emperors did something desperate. They began to debase the silver coinage, the denarius, by mixing more and more copper into it. At first, the coins just looked a little paler, but over time, the silver content dwindled to almost nothing. It was a hidden tax, a quiet betrayal of public trust. As the coins became less valuable, prices began to soar. A measure of grain that cost a handful of coins one year might require a sackful a decade later. This was inflation, a term we know well today, but for the Romans it was a mysterious and terrifying force. The solidity of money, one of the foundations of that great Mediterranean trade network, was turning to sand in their hands. Savings evaporated, long-distance commerce became a gamble, and a deep, quiet anxiety seeped into daily life. The empire was not being attacked by a single, mighty foe, but was instead beginning to fray from within, like a heavy tapestry whose threads are loosened one by one. The machine was still running, but the groans were growing louder, the motions more jerky and uncoordinated. This was the first true taste of decline, not as a dramatic fall, but as a gradual, exhausting slide. And as the center struggled to hold, the eyes of the world naturally began to turn toward the vast, silent borders where new pressures were quietly building. The political and economic chaos of the 3rd century finally produced a man who refused to let the machine break. His name was Diocletian, a soldier emperor who ascended the throne in the year 284, and he looked upon the crumbling empire not with despair, but with the cold, analytical eye of an engineer surveying a failing dam. The problem, as he saw it, was fundamentally one of scale. The empire had simply grown too vast, its borders too long, and its internal challenges too numerous for one man in Rome to manage. Barbarian pressures on the Rhine, the Danube, and in the east required immediate, localized military responses. Provincial revolts and economic collapse needed constant oversight. The old system, where a single emperor tried to be everywhere at once, was a recipe for continual crisis. So Diocletian did not try to restore the old peace. Instead, he re-engineered the empire itself. His solution was as radical as it was logical. He would divide to rule. This was the birth of the tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Diocletian split the empire into 2 major halves, east and west. He would rule the east from a new capital he established at Nicomedia in modern-day Turkey. He appointed a trusted colleague, Maximian, as a co-emperor to rule the west from Milan, which was far more strategically located than distant Rome for defending the Rhine frontier. But Diocletian did not stop there. Understanding that 2 men could still be overwhelmed, he created a second tier of power. Each senior emperor, called an Augustus, would have a junior partner, a Caesar, who was designated as their successor. So there were 4 rulers in total, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, each assigned a specific geographic region to administer and defend. It was a system designed for stability and seamless succession, an attempt to replace the violent lottery of the barracks with a clear, bureaucratic ladder. The change felt monumental, yet strangely impersonal. Rome, the ancient heart, was quietly sidelined, its sentimental power traded for military and administrative efficiency. New imperial capitals rose not as cities of grand public forums for the people, but as fortified command centers, hubs of tax collection and military logistics. The government grew more layered, more complex. A vast bureaucracy expanded to manage the new system, with countless officials now required to coordinate between the 4 courts. It was like watching the gears of a giant, ancient clock being taken apart and recalibrated with new, interlocking pieces. The goal was perfect mechanical order. For a time, it worked. The frontiers were stabilized, the rampant inflation was brutally checked with wage and price controls, and the constant civil wars ceased. The empire, for a generation, caught its breath, yet this salvation came at a profound cost. The soul of the empire, that unified Mediterranean world connected by a shared identity as Romans, began to subtly fracture. One could now speak of a Roman Empire in the east and a Roman Empire in the west as distinct entities. The machine was repaired, but in dividing it to save it, Diocletian had quietly set the stage for a final, permanent separation. Diocletian's grand machine of 4 rulers soon began to shudder and stall, its carefully engineered gears of succession grinding against the old, human hunger for undivided power. From this final round of civil wars emerged a single, transformative victor, a man whose personal vision would reshape the empire's soul and its geography forever. His name was Constantine. The story of his rise is inseparable from a moment of profound personal mystery. On the eve of a decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, Constantine reportedly saw a sign in the heavens. The accounts vary, but the essence is dreamlike, a vision of a cross of light and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shields, and against all odds he won. Whether this was a genuine spiritual awakening or a brilliant stroke of political intuition is a debate for the ages, but the consequence was earth-shattering. With the Edict of Milan in the year 313, Constantine granted official tolerance to Christianity, ending centuries of sporadic persecution. The faith that had grown in the catacombs was now invited into the palace. This was more than a religious shift, it was a seismic change in the empire's identity. The old pagan gods tied to the hills and rivers of Italy began to recede, while a new, universal faith with its roots in the East started to provide the spiritual glue for a fragmenting world. Constantine's gaze, however, was fixed on a more tangible horizon. He understood what Diocletian had seen, that the empire's center of gravity had irrevocably shifted. The West was straining under barbarian pressure and economic weakness, while the wealthier, more populous provinces of the East beckoned. So he made a decision that felt both dazzlingly new and quietly inevitable. He would build a new Rome. He chose a perfect location, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, perched on a peninsula where Europe met Asia, controlling the narrow, vital strait of the Bosphorus. Here he poured the treasury's wealth into a city meant to outshine the old capital. They called it Constantinople. Imagine the scene, if you can, in that half-dream state before sleep. 1,000 ships laden with marble from across the empire, columns hauled from pagan temples in Ephesus and Athens, bronze statues melted down for new monuments. The city rose not from the slow accumulation of centuries, but as a single, breathtaking act of will. Its walls were thicker, its streets grander, its churches, like the magnificent Hagia Sophia that would later be built, more awe-inspiring than anything in the fading West. It was a symbol of dazzling renewal, a phoenix rising from the ashes of the old crises. Yet for all its glitter, the founding of Constantinople was also a quiet, monumental admission. It was the empire's heart, not just its administration, slowly migrating eastward like a tide pulling away from a familiar shore. The Senate still met in Rome, but true power, along with the emperor's permanent court, now resided in this shimmering fortress on the Bosphorus. The old capital, with its empty palaces and nostalgic grandeur, was left to its memories, becoming more a museum of past glory than the engine of present power. Constantine had not just built a city, he had anchored the future of the Roman world in a new soil. And as he did so, he set in motion a slow, deep divergence between two halves of a single body, one looking hopefully toward a new dawn, the other watching the long shadows gather in the west. For centuries, the Rhine and Danube rivers had served as more than just geographical lines on a map. They were the psychological and military threshold of the civilized world, a liquid frontier where the ordered fields and stone villas of Rome gave way to the dark, whispering forests of what the Romans simply called barbaricum. Beyond these rivers lived hundreds of tribes, a mosaic of peoples the Romans grouped under broad, often inaccurate names: the Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths. Their relationship with the empire was not one of constant war, but a complex, enduring symbiosis. They traded for Roman goods, served as mercenaries in the Roman army, and sometimes raided across the river when the legions looked the other way. It was an uneasy, managed coexistence, a tense but familiar rhythm along a fortified shore. Then, in the 4th century, that rhythm was shattered by a new, terrifying beat from the distant east. The arrival of the Huns, a confederation of nomadic horsemen from the Central Asian steppes, set off a chain reaction of displacement that would slowly but irrevocably overwhelm the empire's defenses. The Huns moved with a speed and ferocity that was utterly alien to both the Romans and the Germanic tribes. They were masters of the horse, seeming to live in the saddle, and their mounted archers could unleash storms of arrows before an opposing force could even get close. They did not seek to conquer and settle land in the Roman sense. They sought plunder and tribute, sweeping across the grasslands and pushing everything before them like a human avalanche. This pressure from the east created a domino effect. One tribe pushed from its traditional lands would in turn push against its neighbor, setting entire populations into motion. This was not a coordinated invasion, but a desperate, slow migration of whole peoples, men, women, children, and their livestock searching for safety. The Visigoths, a Gothic tribe, were among the first to feel this crushing pressure. Harried relentlessly by the Huns, they massed on the banks of the Danube in the year 376, a frightened multitude numbering in the tens of thousands. They did not come as an army, but as a refugee nation, pleading with the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the river and settle on imperial soil, promising to become loyal subjects and soldiers. Valens, seeing an opportunity to bolster his own military with new recruits, agreed. It was a momentous decision, a breach in the ancient frontier not made by force but by administrative decree. The Roman system, however, was utterly unprepared for the logistical nightmare of integrating such a vast number of people. Corrupt officials exploited the starving Goths, selling them dog meat for the price of slaves. Resentment festered, then boiled over into open revolt. Just 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, these same Gothic refugees, now battle-hardened and furious, annihilated the Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. It was a catastrophic defeat that revealed a profound truth. The empire could no longer simply keep the barbarians out, because the barbarians were already inside, and they had learned how to fight like Romans. This pattern would repeat with variations for the next century. The Vandals, another tribe displaced by the chain reaction, embarked on an epic, meandering journey. They moved from Central Europe through Gaul into Spain and finally, most devastatingly, across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. They were not a tsunami wiping the slate clean, but more like a relentless, slow-moving river carving a new course through the landscape of the empire. They did not seek to destroy Roman civilization outright. In fact, they often admired it and wanted a share of its wealth and security. Their leaders adopted Roman titles, their warriors enlisted in Roman service, and their kings negotiated complex treaties with the emperors. The relationship was a chaotic, centuries-long dance of push and pull, of treaties made and broken, of alliances formed and then betrayed. The Western Empire's response grew increasingly fragmented and local. Powerful Roman generals, often of barbarian origin themselves, would cut deals with one tribal group to fight another, temporarily stabilizing one province while weakening another. The border itself, that clear, fortified line, ceased to exist. Instead, there were pockets of Roman authority and vast areas where tribal kingdoms operated with increasing autonomy, all nominally still part of the empire, but in practice drifting away. It was a demographic tide, patient and inexorable, lapping at the foundations of the state. Each wave, whether of Goths, Vandals, Franks, or Angles and Saxons crossing to Britain, did not topple the structure in one blow. Instead, each wave carried away a little more of its cohesion, its tax revenue, its sense of unified identity. The empire did not fall to a single enemy, but slowly dissolved into a new pattern, as the pressure of countless thousands seeking a place within its borders finally, gently, eroded the very idea of where those borders were. The year was 410. For 800 years since a band of Gauls had briefly occupied its streets, the city of Rome had been inviolable. Its walls, its legions, and its immense prestige had formed an invisible shield, a belief so deeply held it felt like a law of nature. Rome could not fall. Then, on a late summer day, that shield shattered. Alaric, a Visigothic king who had spent years negotiating, demanding, and fighting the Western Roman court for a permanent homeland and recognition, finally lost patience. His army, camped outside the city, was let inside through the Salarian gate. The details of how remain a quiet mystery. Was it opened by sympathetic slaves, or was it a negotiated entry? The result was the same. For 3 days the Visigoths entered the Eternal City. This was not the fiery, cinematic destruction later legends would suggest. Alaric was a Christian and a former Roman commander. He ordered his men to respect sacred places, particularly the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. There was looting, certainly. Treasure from patrician villas was hauled away and some buildings were burned. But the true violence of the event was not in the streets, it was in the mind. The sack was a psychological earthquake, a tremor that raced through the entire consciousness of the ancient world. Imagine the news traveling not at the speed of light, but at the speed of a horse or a ship. A messenger arrives in a distant province, his face ashen. The governor reads the dispatch and simply stares, unable to comprehend the words. A merchant in Alexandria hears the rumor in the marketplace and feels the solid world beneath him grow suddenly uncertain. In his monastic cell in Bethlehem, the great scholar Jerome received the reports and wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat and sobs choke my utterance." The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The shock was not about stone and mortar. Rome had long since ceased to be the seat of imperial power. Emperors ruled from Ravenna or Milan. The shock was about an idea, the idea of permanence itself. Rome was the fixed point in the universe, the eternal city. If it could be breached, if its sacred spaces could be walked by foreign soldiers, then what was safe? What order was left in the world? The event sent a silent, chilling message to every province, every general, every citizen. The unthinkable had been thought, the impossible had happened. The echo of those 3 days in 410 would resonate for centuries, a deep, mournful note that signaled not the end of the empire, but the end of its invincible myth. The body was still alive, but its soul had received a wound from which it would never truly recover. The eternal city's myth was broken, but the empire itself still had a body, one that was now retreating into a strange, watery refuge. By the early 5th century, the Western emperors had abandoned Rome entirely, moving their court to the city of Ravenna, nestled in the marshes of Italy's northeastern coast. It was a fortress of last resort, chosen not for its grandeur or history, but for its profound defensibility. Surrounded by lagoons and connected to the mainland by a single causeway, Ravenna was a place where the land itself seemed unsure if it was solid or liquid. Here, the last emperors of the West ruled. Their names now echo faintly from the history books, figures like Honorius, Valentinian III, and finally Romulus Augustulus. They were not the titans of old. More often than not, they were children or adolescents when they were placed on the throne, puppets whose strings were pulled by powerful generals, almost all of whom were of barbarian origin. The real power lay with men like Flavius Stilicho, a Vandal by birth who became the empire's supreme commander, or later Ricimer, a man of mixed barbarian blood who became the kingmaker behind a succession of short-lived emperors. The imperial court in Ravenna became a theater of shadows. Its authority, once stretching from Britain to Africa, had shrunk like a drying puddle. By the mid-5th century, effective control had receded to Italy alone. Gaul was a patchwork of Visigothic and Burgundian kingdoms. Spain was held by the Suebi and later the Visigoths. North Africa, the vital grain province, was the wealthy kingdom of the Vandals. Britain had been abandoned by the legions decades earlier, left to its own fate. The emperor still issued decrees and minted coins bearing his profile, but these were gestures of a fading dream. His power was like the light in Ravenna's famous mosaics, brilliant and glittering when seen up close within the palace walls, but unable to illuminate the growing darkness beyond the marshes. The government grew detached, preoccupied with court intrigue and survival, while the provinces learned to live without it. Cities made their own deals with local barbarian warlords for protection. Local landowners raised their own militias. The great, centralized machine of the state was winding down, its parts falling silent one by one. The tide of the Adriatic would recede from Ravenna's muddy shores each day, revealing the wet, glistening earth before returning. In much the same quiet, inevitable rhythm, the tide of imperial power was ebbing away, leaving behind a changed landscape where new kingdoms were beginning to take root in the soft, exposed soil. The year was 476. In the quiet, waterlocked palace at Ravenna, a boy sat on a throne he had never truly occupied. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name that echoed with the ghosts of empire. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, and Augustulus, a diminutive form of Augustus, its first great emperor. He was likely no more than 15 years old, a figurehead placed there by his father, a Roman general of barbarian descent. For nearly a year, he had reigned in name only, his authority a fragile fiction that extended barely beyond the marsh-girt walls of his capital. The real power in Italy belonged to the armies, and they now answered to a man named Odoacer, a commander of Germanic origin whose soldiers were restless for land. Odoacer did not march on Ravenna in a furious siege. He simply moved his forces, and the boy emperor's court, isolated and powerless, offered no resistance. There was no grand battle, no last stand, no burning of the palace. What happened next was a transaction, not a conquest. Odoacer entered Ravenna, and Romulus Augustulus was gently, almost respectfully, deposed. The Germanic general did not have the boy killed. Instead, he granted him a pension and sent him to live in a comfortable villa in Campania. The imperial regalia, the purple robe, the diadem, were not destroyed. Odoacer had them carefully packed up and sent to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, with a message. It was a message that changed the world through paperwork. Odoacer declared that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. One emperor in the East was sufficient for the entire Roman world. He asked only that Zeno grant him the legitimate title of patrician, a Roman governor, so he could administer Italy on the empire's behalf. Zeno, embroiled in his own troubles, gave a vague and diplomatic assent. And with that, the office of the Western Roman Emperor, a position that had commanded legions and shaped laws for 500 years, simply ceased to exist. It was not abolished with a decree, it was allowed to lapse like a subscription that no one bothered to renew. The date 476 would later be etched in history books as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But in the moment, it felt nothing like a fall. There was no crash, no sudden darkness. It was a quiet administrative adjustment, the final exhalation of a political body that had long ago stopped breathing on its own. Life in Italy went on. The sun rose the next day over fields still being plowed. People went to market. The great landowners still managed their estates. But now they paid their taxes to King Odoacer, not to an emperor in Ravenna. The machinery of daily life continued to turn, but the nameplate on the engine had been quietly, almost politely changed. It was an ending so undramatic, so bureaucratic, that it begs a profound question. If an empire can fall without a cataclysm, without most of its people even noticing the precise moment it happened, then what truly does it mean for a civilization to end? The quiet end of the imperial office in Ravenna was a symptom, not the disease itself. To understand why the Western Roman Empire faded while the Eastern endured, we must listen to the deeper sound beneath the political drama, the slow, weary sigh of an economy running out of breath. Imagine the empire not as a fortress under siege, but as a vast, complex body, its lifeblood the steady flow of silver coin and grain moving along the roads and sea lanes. By the 4th and 5th centuries, that body was suffering from a profound case of exhaustion. The financial veins were hardening. The state faced an impossible equation. Its expenses were monumental and ever-growing, while its sources of income were shrinking. The primary expense was the army. To hold the disintegrating frontiers, the empire needed more and more soldiers, and those soldiers demanded regular pay, often in gold. Then there was the immense, top-heavy bureaucracy, the thousands of officials needed to administer Diocletian's divided system and Constantine's new capital. And let us not forget the colossal building projects, the new walls, the new churches, the maintenance of aqueducts and roads. The treasury was like a great bowl with a dozen holes drilled in the bottom, and the only solution the state could find was to pour more and more into the top relentlessly from a dwindling supply. This led to the crushing weight of the tax system. To fund its survival, the late Roman state perfected a machinery of extraction that became a burden in itself. Tax collectors were everywhere, their assessments ruthless and inescapable. The primary tax fell on land and the people who worked it, a system that bound farmers, the coloni, to their plots, creating an early form of serfdom. For a city dweller or a small landowner, a bad harvest did not mean just hunger. It meant financial ruin, as the tax demand remained the same, an immutable stone weight. Many simply fled their lands, abandoning towns to seek the protection of a local strongman, further reducing the tax base and creating a vicious cycle. The government responded not by easing the burden, but by chasing the fleeing taxpayers and pressing those who remained even harder. The feeling across the provinces was not one of vibrant citizenship, but of being perpetually squeezed by a distant, desperate master. At the same time, the very medium of exchange was disintegrating. We saw earlier the 3rd century emperors debasing the silver coinage. Later reforms created new coins, but confidence in money never fully recovered. In many regions, people simply stopped using the low-quality bronze small change for everyday transactions, reverting to barter, trading a chicken for a length of cloth or a day's labor for a sack of wheat. This collapse of a unified currency strangled the long-distance trade that had been the empire's hallmark. Why would a merchant in Gaul risk a shipment of wine to Italy if he could not be sure of receiving trustworthy coin, or if the roads were too dangerous, or if the market in a distant city had collapsed? One by one, those economic threads connecting Britain to Syria snapped. The great networks of specialized production, Spanish pottery, Egyptian linen, Syrian glass, began to unravel. Regions could no longer rely on imports. They had to produce everything they needed locally or go without. This economic retreat is perfectly symbolized by the changing landscape itself. The bustling, open cities of the early empire, dependent on trade and state salaries, began to empty and decay. In their place, the center of gravity shifted to the self-sufficient rural villa. These were not just country homes, they were fortified economic units, miniature worlds unto themselves. A powerful landowner, a patron, would offer protection to the local farmers in exchange for their labor and loyalty. The villa had its own fields, its own workshops for making tools and cloth, its own guards. It produced what it consumed and consumed what it produced. This was the world of the later empire, quietly turning inward, away from the interconnected Mediterranean and toward isolated local survival. Money, trade, and the centralized state meant less and less here. The empire did not end because the barbarians destroyed its economy. They walked into a space that was already emptying, an economic ghost town. The West fell because it grew financially weary, its economic veins slowly hardening until the lifeblood of commerce and revenue could no longer reach the heart. The body politic in Ravenna did not die from a sword stroke. It expired from a quiet, systemic failure, a slow stillness that settled over its fields and markets long before the last emperor laid down his crown. But who was left to defend this weary, inward-turning world? The story of Rome's military in its final centuries is one of quiet, profound transformation. a slow motion blurring of the line between defender and invader that left the empire defenseless not from a lack of soldiers but from a loss of itself. The legendary legions of the early empire, those disciplined formations of heavily armored infantry who built fortresses and roads as readily as they fought battles, were a relic of a different age. They were citizens in arms tied to the Roman state by pay, pension, and a shared cultural identity. By the 4th century, that model was obsolete. The empire could no longer rely on drawing enough recruits from its own civilian population, which was shrinking under economic strain and plague. And the nature of the threat had changed. The frontier needed fast, flexible cavalry to chase down mounted raiders, not slow-moving blocks of infantry. So the military adapted in a way that would ultimately hollow out its core. The army became professionalized in a new sense, a separate, often hereditary class, living in its own world along the frontiers. More critically, it became increasingly barbarized. This was not a sudden invasion of foreigners, but a deliberate, pragmatic policy. Roman generals, desperate for manpower, began recruiting entire tribes from across the frontier. These groups, called foederati or federates, were not drafted into the legions as individuals. They entered Roman service as complete units under their own chieftains, fighting with their own weapons and tactics. In exchange for land and pay, they pledged to defend the empire. On paper, it was a brilliant solution. It turned potential enemies into border guards, using barbarian ferocity to shield Roman civilization. But in practice, it was the empire slowly outsourcing its own defense to the very forces that threatened it. Imagine a great landowner, his villa walls crumbling, who hires the bandits lurking in the nearby woods to stand guard at his gate. At first, the arrangement works. The bandits, now paid and legitimized, keep other ruffians away. But their loyalty is to their chieftain and their own band, not to the landowner or the idea of the villa itself. Their presence inside the gate changes the very atmosphere of the place. The old household guards grow resentful or are dismissed. The landowner's authority now depends entirely on his ability to keep paying and pleasing his new, more dangerous protectors. This was the reality of the late Roman West. Roman-born soldiers became a minority in their own army. The highest military commands, the titles of Master of Soldiers, were frequently held by men of barbarian origin like Stilicho the Vandal or Ricimer the Suebian. These men were often fiercely loyal to the idea of Rome, but their primary bond was to their own soldiers who shared their ethnic and tribal ties. The army was no longer a Roman institution that included barbarians. It was a barbarian institution that served a Roman state, and only for as long as it was advantageous. The consequences of this shift were subtle and devastating. The foederati had no deep connection to the provinces they were supposed to protect. They were mercenaries in all but name. If pay was late, or if they were ordered to move to a different frontier, they might simply revolt or negotiate a better deal with a rival emperor or a different barbarian king. And because they fought in their own style, the intricate, coordinated tactics of the legions, the very art of Roman warfare, faded from memory. The Roman way of war dissolved into a collection of disparate warbands, all flying the same banner but listening to different drums. This blurring reached its logical, quiet conclusion in the 5th century. When a province was overrun, it was often not by a foreign horde smashing through a defensive line, but by the Federate troops already stationed there deciding to settle down and take the land for themselves with the blessing of a local treaty. The protectors became the landlords, the generals became the kings. Odoacer, who deposed the last emperor, was simply the most successful example of this centuries-long trend. He didn't conquer Italy, he was already its military commander. His takeover was less a violent coup and more a corporate restructuring, where the head of security finally dismissed the board of directors. The Western Empire did not fall because its armies were defeated in a final, cataclysmic battle. It faded because it gradually forgot how to defend itself, subcontracting its survival to others until one day, the subcontractors realized they no longer needed to send the bill. They already owned the company. A profound change was taking place in the very soul of Roman society, a quiet reorientation of human energy away from the city square and toward the inner self. For centuries, the glue that held the vast imperial project together was not just legions or laws, but a powerful idea known as virtus. This was more than bravery, it was civic virtue, a deep-seated belief that a man's highest purpose was to contribute to the glory and stability of the state. It was the spirit that built aqueducts and funded public games, that motivated wealthy citizens to serve as mayors and councillors in their hometowns without pay, simply for the honor and the good of the community. The ideal Roman was a public man, his identity woven into the fabric of the forum, the baths, and the Senate. Yet by the late Empire, this fresco of civic duty was fading, its colors growing dull under the weight of time and trouble. The relentless political instability and the crushing tax burden made public service feel less like an honor and more like a perilous liability. Why pour your fortune into repairing a city temple when an imperial official might confiscate your estate tomorrow? Why serve on a town council if you are personally responsible for extracting impossible taxes from your destitute neighbors? The risks began to vastly outweigh the rewards. Many of the educated elite, the very class that had once governed the empire, simply withdrew. They retreated behind the walls of their fortified country villas, turning their backs on the decaying cities and the burdens of office. Their world shrank from the empire to the estate, their concern from the public good to private survival. This retreat created a quiet vacuum of leadership and care in the 1,000 towns across the West. No one was left to organize the grain supply, to maintain the roads, or to rally the community. The public space, both physical and metaphorical, began to empty out. At the same time, a new and powerful force was redirecting the collective imagination. The rise of Christianity, especially after Constantine, did not destroy Rome, but it fundamentally altered what many people believed was most important. The early Roman worldview was centered on the here and now, on the glory of the city and the memory a man left in this world. The Christian worldview introduced a powerful, competing focus, the salvation of the soul and a glorious afterlife in the next world. Think of it as a shift in gravity. Where once society's gravitational pull drew energy toward the Senate House and the battlefield, now a significant portion of its most passionate and thoughtful citizens felt pulled toward the church and the monastery. The greatest minds were no longer debating law and governance in the forum, but theology in ecclesiastical councils. The most ambitious building projects were not new aqueducts or courthouses, but magnificent basilicas like St. Peter's. For the devout, the true empire was not Rome, but the city of God. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a transformation of hope. When Alaric's Goths sacked Rome in 410, the reaction of the Christian writer St. Augustine was telling. In his monumental work, The City of God, he consoled his followers by arguing that the earthly city was always temporary and prone to collapse. True safety, true permanence, belonged only to the spiritual community of believers. This was a profoundly comforting thought in a collapsing world, but it also subtly encouraged a kind of holy resignation toward the fate of the material empire. If the state was corrupt and the world was ending, why pour your last efforts into propping it up? Better to prepare for eternity. The immense human energy that had once gone into maintaining the machinery of state was now being channeled into prayer, charity, and theological debate, a transfusion of vitality from a dying body to a nascent spiritual one. Beneath these ideological shifts ran a slower, more physical decay, a simple dwindling of people. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, was a pre-industrial society that relied on human muscle power. Its armies, its farms, its tax base all required a large, healthy population. That population began to shrink. A series of devastating plagues, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, killing millions and never allowing numbers to fully recover. Constant warfare, both civil and on the frontiers, took a steady toll. Economic hardship led to lower birth rates as families could not afford to feed many children. Some historians suggest there was even a cultural shift among the elite, who began having fewer children to preserve their wealth for a single heir. The result was a quiet, continent-wide thinning out. Abandoned farmland, known as agri deserti, became a common sight. Villages shrank, cities felt emptier. This demographic decline was a silent multiplier of every other problem. Fewer farmers meant less food and less tax revenue. Fewer citizens meant a smaller pool of army recruits, making the reliance on barbarian federates not just a policy choice but a demographic necessity. A society with a shrinking, aging population loses its vitality and its capacity for renewal. It becomes more conservative, more inward-looking, less able to absorb shocks or innovate. The collective energy required to maintain something as vast and complex as the Roman Empire was simply dissipating like heat from a cooling stone. People were turning inward toward their faith, their family, and their local patron because the great imperial project now felt too distant, too burdensome, and too fragile to merit their full devotion. The story of the fall is in part the story of a shared dream slowly being forgotten as one by one, the dreamers turned over in their sleep and began to dream of different worlds. While the sun set on the imperial office in the west, it continued to rise, brilliant and unwavering, over the Bosphorus. The year 476 was not an ending for the entire Roman world, but a moment of profound divergence. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we often call Byzantium, did not fall. It endured, a vibrant and wealthy civilization that carried the Roman torch for another full millennium, all the way until the walls of Constantinople were finally breached in the year 1453. This is the part of the story where the narrative transforms, reminding us that empires are not monolithic but living organisms, and while one branch may wither, another can find new strength. The city Constantine built was more than a new capital, it was a fortress of continuity. While Ravenna was a damp refuge and Rome a museum of memories, Constantinople in the 5th and 6th centuries was the beating heart of the world. Its strategic position was unmatched, a natural citadel controlling the sea lane between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and the land route between Europe and Asia. Wealth flowed into its harbors like water, the tariffs from trade filling the imperial coffers with a reliable stream of gold, the solid gold solidus coin that remained the dollar of the medieval world for centuries. The city itself was a spectacle of overwhelming grandeur. Imagine sailing into the Golden Horn, its waters thick with ships from Alexandria, Venice, and Crimea. Before you, the massive Theodosian walls rose, a triple layer of fortifications that would defy armies for 1,000 years. Inside, broad avenues lined with colonnades led to the immense hippodrome, where 100,000 citizens could cheer on chariot races, and to the crowning glory, the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, its revolutionary dome appearing to float on a cascade of light. Here, the Roman state never lost its bureaucratic muscle or its military cohesion. Emperors in Constantinople still commanded professional armies, still appointed governors, and still collected taxes with an efficiency that their Western counterparts could only dream of. The East faced its own crises, to be sure, including devastating wars with the Persian Empire and later the explosive rise of Islam. But its core institutions, its economic base, and its unbroken line of imperial authority provided a resilience the West had long since lost. The contrast is startling. In the West, a local landowner might barter wheat for nails on a quiet, self-sufficient estate. In the East, a silk merchant in Constantinople could contract for a shipment of spices from India, pay for it with gold coins accepted from Antioch to Cherson, and have the shipment protected by imperial patrol galleys. The Eastern Empire was not a survivor clinging to ruins. It was a brilliant, evolving continuation of the Roman idea, speaking Greek instead of Latin, worshipping in domed churches instead of pagan temples, but maintaining the law, the diplomacy, and the monumental ambition of Rome. The fall of the West was not the death of Rome, but a slow amputation. The body lived on, adapted, and for 1,000 more years ensured that the light of the ancient world was never fully extinguished. Centuries after the West faded into a patchwork of kingdoms, the emperor in Constantinople still dreamed of a single, undivided Rome. In the 6th century, one man decided to turn that dream into a reality, no matter the cost. His name was Justinian, and he possessed a vision that was both magnificent and profoundly nostalgic. He saw not the new, thriving Eastern Empire around him, but the ghost of the old, complete map from Britain to the Euphrates. With his formidable wife, Theodora, by his side, he launched the most ambitious military campaign since the days of the Caesars, a grand project to stitch the severed halves of the empire back together. To lead this impossible task, he found a general of genius, Belisarius. The campaigns that followed read like an epic poem. With a surprisingly small, superbly trained army, Belisarius sailed to North Africa and in a single, brilliant year, shattered the Vandal kingdom that had ruled there for a century. The grain basket of the Old West was Roman once more. Emboldened, Justinian set his sights on the heart of the dream itself, Italy. Belisarius landed in Sicily and marched north, and in the year 536, his troops entered the city of Rome through the Asinarian Gate. For the first time in 60 years, the Eternal City flew the banners of a Roman emperor, though that emperor now ruled from a throne 1,000 miles to the east. The victories continued, with parts of southern Spain also reclaimed from the Visigoths. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if time had reversed. The Mediterranean was nearly a Roman lake again, and the map in the palaces of Constantinople looked almost whole. But this reconquest was a phantom, a glorious echo without the substance to sustain it. Justinian's dream was catastrophically expensive. The campaigns drained the treasury that centuries of Eastern trade had filled. The cost of maintaining Belisarius's armies, of building fleets, of bribing allies, and of fortifying newly won territories was astronomical. To pay for it, Justinian's tax collectors became more ruthless than ever, squeezing the prosperous eastern provinces until they groaned. The great legal code he commissioned, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was a lasting gift to the world, but its creation was funded by gold stripped from an empire already straining under its own ambition. And the human cost was even more devastating. The war for Italy was not a swift liberation. It dragged on for 20 brutal years, a relentless tug of war with the Ostrogoths that ravaged the peninsula. Rome itself was besieged, captured, and recaptured multiple times. The aqueducts were cut, the population starved, and the great senatorial families were decimated. What Belisarius had won with tactical brilliance, a war of attrition slowly unmade. The Italy that was reconquered was a shattered, depopulated shell, its cities in ruins and its fields laid waste. The effort left the Eastern Empire breathless. The army was stretched thin across thousands of miles, the treasury was empty, and the loyalty of the overburdened people was fraying. Justinian's dream was the last deep breath of the unified Roman ideal, a magnificent and costly gasp. When he died in the year 565, the map still looked impressive, but the empire was exhausted. It had poured its strength into resurrecting a ghost, and in doing so, it had weakened the vibrant, living body that was its future. The reconquered territories in the West soon began to slip away again, impossible to hold. The great breath was released, and a long, quiet rest began as the East turned its focus inward, consolidating and defending what it had always held, leaving the West to its new, emerging dreams. Just as the empire was catching its breath from Justinian's exhausting wars, a far quieter and more terrible enemy slipped ashore. In the year 541, rats carrying infected fleas scurried down the gangplanks of grain ships arriving in the Egyptian port of Pelusium from the distant Red Sea. This was the bubonic plague, the same disease that would ravage Europe centuries later as the Black Death. It moved with a silence more profound than any army's march. From Egypt, it traveled along the trade routes that were the empire's lifeblood, reaching the great metropolis of Constantinople by the following spring. The historian Procopius, who witnessed it, described a city transformed into a waking nightmare. The symptoms began innocuously, a mild fever, but within days, victims would develop dark, painful swellings or buboes in their groins or armpits. Many fell into a deep coma, others were driven mad by delirium before death claimed them. There was no cure, only a desperate, terrified hope for survival. The scale of the suffering is almost beyond comprehension. At its peak, Procopius records that 10,000 people were dying in Constantinople every single day. The city's systems broke down. There were not enough hands to bury the dead. Bodies were stacked inside towers of the great city walls or piled into boats that were simply cast adrift in the sea. The streets, once roaring with the noise of 1 million people, fell into an eerie, hollow quiet, broken only by the muffled cries from shuttered houses. The harbors grew still, their ships anchored, their crews dead or fled. In the countryside, the silence was even more absolute. Fields of golden wheat stood untended, for there was no one left to harvest them. Villages were emptied, their hearths gone cold. The plague did not discriminate. It consumed the young and the old, the peasant and the senator, the soldier and the priest. It swept through the empire in relentless waves over the next 2 centuries, returning again and again to claim new generations. This was a catastrophe of biology, not politics or war, and its impact was both immediate and permanent. The empire's greatest strength, its dense, urbanized population and its intricate networks of trade and agriculture, became its greatest vulnerability. The workforce was decimated. With no one to farm, tax revenues collapsed. With no merchants to sail, commerce withered. The army, already strained, could not replace its fallen soldiers. The plague did not destroy the Eastern Empire, which would endure for centuries more, but it dealt a blow from which it never fully recovered. It drained the vitality from a civilization already wearied by ambition, like a slow, internal bleeding that saps the strength without a visible wound. The grand project ceased, the sense of momentum faded. A deep, collective fatigue set in, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had grown smaller, darker, and far more fragile. In the silent aftermath, the dream of a restored Rome seemed not just expensive but utterly futile. The real enemy had never carried a sword or a banner. It had arrived on tiny, skittering feet, and it had changed everything by simply taking away the people who made the empire run. The empire that had survived the plague now faced a slow, relentless pressure on its eastern flank. For centuries, the great rival of Rome had been the Parthian Empire, but in the 3rd century, a new, more formidable Persian dynasty rose, the Sasanians. They were not nomadic raiders, but a sophisticated, centralized state with a proud imperial tradition of their own, viewing themselves as the heirs of ancient Persia and the equals, if not the superiors, of Rome. The relationship between Constantinople and the Persian capital of Ctesiphon was a tense, permanent stalemate, punctuated by long, draining wars. These were not quick border skirmishes, but massive, generation-spanning conflicts that saw armies march back and forth across the arid landscapes of Mesopotamia and Armenia. One emperor might capture a string of Persian forts, only for his successor to lose them a decade later. The cost was staggering in gold and in lives, a perpetual drain on the treasuries and manpower of both empires. They were like two titans locked in a centuries-long wrestling match, each using immense energy just to hold the other at bay, muscles straining, neither able to secure a decisive victory. This exhausting equilibrium left both giants weary, their borders heavily fortified but their inner reserves depleted. Then, in the 7th century, from the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, came a force that neither exhausted empire was prepared to withstand. The rise of Islam was not just a religious revelation, it was a political and military earthquake. Unified by a powerful new faith, Arab armies erupted from the desert with a speed and zeal that shattered the ancient order. The timing was catastrophic for Byzantium. The empire was still recovering from its last brutal war with Persia, a conflict so total it had seen Persian armies reach the very shores of the Bosphorus and camp in sight of Constantinople itself. Though the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had achieved a seemingly miraculous victory, reclaiming lost territories including the True Cross from Jerusalem, the triumph was hollow. Both empires lay prostrate, their armies shattered, their provinces ravaged and discontented. Into this vacuum the Arab forces moved. They were masters of desert warfare, moving fast and striking hard. The rich, ancient provinces that had been the economic pillars of the Eastern Empire for 1,000 years began to fall, one after another, in a dizzyingly short span. The great city of Damascus in Syria fell in the year 634. Jerusalem surrendered in 637. By 641, the legions had marched out of Alexandria for the last time. Egypt, the granary of Constantinople, was gone. The loss was not merely territorial, it was existential. These were not distant frontier outposts, but the very heartland of the Eastern Roman world, the source of its grain, its taxes, and its cultural depth. The empire was cut in half. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow shrinkage, a retreat measured in centuries. Constantinople itself, behind its legendary walls, withstood repeated sieges, a bastion that would not fall. But the map was redrawn forever. The Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake, but a contested frontier, with a new Arab naval power emerging to challenge Byzantine control of the sea. The empire contracted, pulling back into a smaller, more defensible core centered on Asia Minor, the Balkans, and the capital itself. It adapted, becoming a more militarized, Greek-speaking state, its horizons necessarily narrowed. This was the final, quiet severing of the ancient world. The cosmopolitan, Mediterranean-wide empire of Justinian's dream was now a memory. What remained was a resilient, compact fortress of a civilization, forever changed, holding the line against a new world it could no longer encompass. The long, draining wars and the rise of Islam had redrawn the map of the old Roman world. But another kind of division was deepening, one that would prove just as permanent and far more intimate. For centuries, the Christian Church had been the single, unifying spiritual force across the empire from Britain to Egypt. Yet as the political halves drifted apart, so too did their understanding of the divine. The differences grew slowly, like a hairline crack in a great cathedral wall, unnoticed at first but widening with each passing season. In the West, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, increasingly asserted his authority as the successor to St. Peter, claiming a unique, supreme role over all Christendom. In the East, the Patriarch of Constantinople and other ancient sees viewed the Church as a family of equals, a communion of sister churches guided by collective councils and the Emperor's protective hand. They spoke different theological languages, literally and figuratively. The West used Latin, the East used Greek, and subtle differences in doctrine, like the phrasing of the Nicene Creed and the use of unleavened bread in communion, became symbols of a growing estrangement. Tensions simmered for generations, fueled by political rivalry and cultural misunderstanding. Then, in the year 1054, the crack became a chasm. A papal legate from Rome marched into the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and laid a bull of excommunication on the high altar. The Patriarch of Constantinople responded in kind. This act, the Great Schism, was not a battle with swords but with parchment and anathema. It was a formal, mutual declaration of spiritual divorce. The single body of Christendom was torn in two, creating the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. The consequences were profound and quiet. A traveler from France could no longer take communion in a Byzantine church. a Byzantine scholar would find the theology of Paris alien and incorrect. The shared spiritual universe that had once connected a Gallic monk to a Syrian herm, it was now split into separate orbits. This was more than a theological dispute, it was the final sundering of a shared soul. After 1054, the dream of a reunited Roman world, even in spirit, faded into impossibility. The East and West were now truly foreign to each other, walking different paths toward salvation, their once shared prayers now echoing in separate vaults of heaven. The spiritual divorce of 1054 left the two halves of Christendom estranged, but a far more violent betrayal was still to come. It arrived not with a pagan horde, but under the banner of the cross itself. In the year 1204, an army of crusaders bound for Egypt to reclaim Jerusalem found itself stranded and bankrupt on the Adriatic coast. Their Venetian financiers demanded payment, and the Crusades' leaders, desperate, accepted a shocking proposal. They would attack the Christian city of Zara, a rival of Venice, to settle their debt. This act of turning their swords on fellow Christians shocked Europe, but it was only a prelude to a far greater sin. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, then arrived with a tempting offer. He promised the Crusaders immense wealth, soldiers for their holy war, and the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches if they would help him depose his uncle and restore him to the throne in Constantinople. The Crusader army, now more a mercenary company than a pilgrim host, agreed. They sailed not for the Holy Land, but for the greatest Christian city on earth. When they arrived, they installed the young prince, but the people of Constantinople revolted against this foreign puppet. The promised payment never materialized, and the Crusaders, furious and now trapped outside the city walls, felt cheated. What happened next was a descent into a nightmare of greed and sacrilege. On the 13th of April, 1204, after a series of fierce assaults, Crusader forces breached the mighty Theodosian walls. They poured into a city that had not fallen to an enemy in 900 years. For 3 days, Constantinople was subjected to an orgy of destruction by soldiers who wore the cross on their surcoats. They did not see fellow believers but schismatics and traitors. They looted palaces, churches, and monasteries with a systematic thoroughness. Priceless relics, golden icons, and ancient statues were hauled away to Venetian ships. The great bronze horses from the Hippodrome were taken to adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Nuns were assaulted in their convents. The magnificent Hagia Sophia itself was desecrated, its altar smashed, its sacred vessels used as drinking cups in a drunken revel. A prostitute was placed on the Patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs. The historian Nistus Choniates, who witnessed the horror, wrote of the invaders tearing apart a magnificent icon of Christ, not for its gold, but to divide the pieces among themselves as if it were common booty. This was not conquest, it was cannibalism. The empire's own cultural and spiritual children, the Latin West, had turned upon it and ripped out its heart. The physical damage was immense, but the psychological wound was mortal. The Byzantines never forgot or forgave this betrayal. It shattered any lingering hope of Christian unity and planted a seed of bitter hatred that would last for centuries. A Latin emperor was installed in Constantinople, but his rule was a hollow pantomime over a shattered realm. The empire splintered into rival Greek states in exile. Though the Byzantines would recapture their capital 57 years later, the empire that returned was a ghost. Its treasury was empty, its trade networks broken, its most precious art and relics scattered across Europe. Its population was decimated and demoralized. The sack of 1204 did not destroy the Eastern Roman Empire in one blow, but it started a slow, fatal bleed of power, prestige, and spirit. The body lived on, but it was anemic, a shadow flitting through the corridors of its own plundered palace, waiting for the next and final blow to fall. 2.5 centuries after the Crusaders' betrayal, the empire was a skeleton of its former self. Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, now ruled little more than its own suburbs and a few scattered islands. Its population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling around in a metropolis built for 1,000,000. The great walls still stood, but behind them, the fields inside the city lay fallow, and grand palaces stood empty and crumbling. The empire was a ghost haunting the space where a civilization once lived, and in the spring of 1453, that ghost was about to meet its exorcist. A young, brilliant, and ruthlessly ambitious sultan named Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne, and he possessed a single, consuming fixation. He would take the city. For him, Constantinople was the ultimate prize, the last remaining barrier to Ottoman dominion, a thorn in the side of his empire and a living insult to his power. He prepared not for a raid, but for an annihilation. He built a fortress, Rumeli Hisari, on the European shore of the Bosphorus to strangle the city's maritime supply lines. He assembled an army of over 80,000 men, including an elite corps of janissaries and a fleet of hundreds of ships to blockade the Golden Horn. Most terrifying of all, he employed a Hungarian cannon founder named Orban to build the largest cannons the world had ever seen. These monstrous bombards could hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton, capable of shattering walls that had stood inviolate for 1,000 years. Against this overwhelming force stood the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. He commanded perhaps 7,000 defenders, a mix of Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but they were not without hope. Their faith was absolute, and their walls were legendary. The triple line of the Theodosian walls had repelled every attacker for a millennium. For 7 weeks those walls held. The giant Ottoman cannons boomed day after day, each thunderous impact sending plumes of dust and shattered masonry into the air. The defenders fought with a desperate, quiet heroism, repairing the breaches each night under cover of darkness, their labors illuminated by flickering torchlight and the distant fires of the Ottoman camp. Constantine moved among his men, fighting as a common soldier, sharing their danger and their dwindling rations. He knew the cause was likely lost, but he was determined to meet his fate with the dignity of a Roman emperor. The final assault began in the early hours of May 29th. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops hurled themselves at the battered walls, their attacks illuminated by the flash of cannon fire and the light of thousands of torches. For hours the defenders held, cutting down the attackers with arrows, stones, and Greek fire. The air was thick with the screams of men, the clash of steel, and the constant, deafening roar of the guns. Then, just as the sun began to lighten the sky, fate turned on a small, forgotten door. A postern gate near the Blasciani Palace, the Kirka Porta, had been left open after a sortie. Ottoman soldiers found it, and a flood of troops poured into the city's outer defenses. At nearly the same moment, a giant bombard finally collapsed a critical section of the wall near the gate of St. Romanus. The janissaries charged through the smoke and rubble. The defense crumbled. Constantine, seeing the banners of the enemy rising inside his city, tore off his imperial insignia so he would not be identified, and with a handful of his closest companions, he plunged into the chaotic melee on the walls. He was never seen again. His body was never found. The last Roman emperor died as his empire died, not in a palace, but in the dust and blood of the breach, vanishing into the legend of his own fall. As the Ottoman troops fanned out through the city, the sounds of battle gave way to other sounds. The desperate, final ringing of church bells from 100 spires, a chaotic, mournful chorus that was suddenly silenced. And then, rising to take its place, the clear, unwavering call to prayer from the muezzin, echoing from the minaret that Mehmed would soon order built beside Hagia Sophia. The great cathedral itself, the heart of Eastern Christendom, was converted into a mosque that very day. The event sent a shockwave through the world. In Rome, the Pope declared it a catastrophe for Christendom. In Moscow, the Grand Prince declared his city the Third Rome, the new protector of the Orthodox faith. But in that quiet moment on a Tuesday in May, something more profound than a military defeat had occurred. A continuous thread of political existence that stretched back to the founding of Rome over 2,000 years before had been definitively cut. The empire born on the banks of the Tiber, which had moved its heart to the Bosphorus, had taken its final, solemn breath. The chapter was closed not with a slow fade, but with the definitive slam of a great historical book. The silence left by the last emperor in the West did not remain empty for long. In the cold of a Christmas morning in the year 800, inside the ancient Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, an extraordinary scene unfolded. The great Frankish king Charlemagne, who had forged a vast kingdom across modern France, Germany, and parts of Italy, knelt in prayer. As he rose, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The congregation, likely rehearsed, roared its approval. In that single, staged moment, the ghost of Rome was formally summoned back from the grave. Charlemagne's new title was a paradox, a deliberate fiction of breathtaking ambition. He was not Roman, his capital was not Rome but Aachen, and his empire was a patchwork of Germanic tribes held together by his personal authority and the muscle of his armies. Yet the title mattered profoundly. It declared that the universal authority of the Caesars, dormant for over 3 centuries in the West, had found a new guardian. This was not a restoration of the old empire, but a rebirth of its idea, now fused inseparably with Christianity. The Pope, by claiming the power to crown an emperor, was making a bold statement of his own, that spiritual authority could legitimize temporal power. And Charlemagne, by accepting, was wrapping his formidable but fragile kingdom in the majestic, timeless cloak of Roman tradition. His empire, which scholars would later call the Holy Roman Empire, was always more ideal than reality. It lacked the centralized bureaucracy, the common law, and the economic unity of its ancient namesake. After Charlemagne's death, it quickly fractured among his grandsons. Yet the title persisted, a coveted prize that would be fought over by German kings for another 1,000 years. The idea proved more durable than any army. Why did this phantom have such power? Because Rome represented order in a world that had descended into deep localism. After the last legions departed, Western Europe had shattered into a mosaic of small, competing kingdoms, duchies, and lordships. Law was local, memory was short, and horizons were rarely beyond the next forest. In this fragmented landscape, the memory of Rome shone like a distant, steady star. Its ruins were everywhere, impossible to ignore. A medieval farmer plowing his field would still turn up Roman coins. A traveler would walk on roads so straight and solid they could only be the work of giants. Monks in Chile scriptoria painstakingly copied not just the Bible, but the works of Cicero and Virgil, preserving the Latin language and the very concepts of civic life. Rome was the lost golden age, the benchmark for civilization itself. To claim its mantle was to claim a legitimacy deeper than bloodline or battle. It was to tap into a story of universal order. So for centuries, German kings would march to Rome to be crowned by the Pope, each ceremony an attempt to bottle that ancient lightning. Their empire was holy because it was blessed by the Church, and Roman because it aspired to a lost unity. It was, as the Enlightenment thinker Voltaire later quipped, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire in the ancient sense, but that is precisely what makes its long shadow so revealing. It shows that the fall of Rome in 476 was not an ending but a transformation. The physical empire of taxes and legions was gone, but its ghost, its towering idea, continued to walk the earth, shaping the dreams of kings and the map of Europe long after its last walls had fallen. The corpse was buried, but the name became a spell repeatedly cast to conjure authority out of thin air. The ghost of Rome never truly left the courtroom. While emperors and legions faded into history, the empire's most durable invention quietly embedded itself into the very structure of thought. This was Roman law, a system not of arbitrary royal decree, but of reasoned principles, written precedent, and the concept that justice should be consistent and accessible to citizens. At its heart was the idea of ius civile, civil law, a complex body of statutes and legal opinions that governed everything from property disputes to inheritance. Centuries after the fall, the great Byzantine Emperor Justinian ordered a monumental compilation of this ancient legal wisdom, the Corpus Juris Civilis. This code became a time capsule, preserving Roman legal logic through the darkest ages. When medieval scholars in places like Bologna rediscovered these texts in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was like finding an operating manual for a civilized society. Kings and emerging nation-states, struggling to move beyond crude tribal customs, eagerly adopted its frameworks. The Roman concepts of contracts, property rights, and legal personhood became the bedrock. Think of a simple modern idea that you can write a will to dictate who inherits your possessions. That is not a universal human instinct. It is a direct inheritance from Roman law, which established clear rules for testamentary succession. This system provided the skeleton for the legal structures of continental Europe, Latin America, and beyond, offering a shared language of order that outlasted the empire's armies by 1,500 years. That shared language was not just metaphorical. Even as you listen to this, you are surrounded by the living breath of ancient Rome. Latin did not die with the last senator. It simply went to sleep in the monasteries and woke up transformed in the mouths of everyday people across the provinces. In the rough camps of Roman soldiers stationed in Gaul, in the markets of Hispania, and on the farms of Italia, the polished classical Latin of Cicero began to blend with local dialects. Over centuries of quiet evolution, it softened, shifted, and branched into new forms. The word for horse, equus in classical Latin, became caballus in the common soldier's slang, which blossomed into the French cheval, the Spanish caballo, and the Italian cavallo. This was not a decay, but an adaptation, a river delta spreading into new lands. From this slow, organic process grew the entire family of Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. They are not separate inventions, but Latin, reshaped by time and geography. And even English, a Germanic language at its core, is saturated with Latin vocabulary, especially in the realms of law, science, and religion, words like justice, animal, and scripture. The empire's voice never fell silent. It merely changed its accent, continuing its conversations in the streets of Paris, the plazas of Madrid, and the cafes of Rome itself. Perhaps the most silent, yet visible, testament to Rome's endurance is the ground beneath our feet and the skyline above. The Romans were not just builders, they were civil engineers who thought in centuries. Their roads were not mere paths, but sophisticated, layered constructions designed to drain water and bear immense weight. They laid them in astonishingly straight lines, conquering geography with a ruler's edge. Long after the imperial post service vanished, these roads remained the primary arteries of medieval Europe, dictating trade routes and pilgrimage paths. They quite literally set the direction for the future. Then consider the humble arch, a shape the Romans perfected with concrete. This single architectural leap allowed them to create spans of breathtaking strength and openness, giving us not only the Colosseum but the basic principle behind 1,000 medieval cathedrals and modern bridges. But their most eloquent monuments are those that served life itself, the aqueducts. These graceful arcades striding across valleys were not for show. They were the empire's circulatory system, bringing fresh water to cities in quantities unmatched until the modern era. When you see their skeletal remains in the countryside of France or Spain, you are not looking at a ruin, you are looking at the skeleton of an idea, the belief that a civilization should provide clean water for its people. Every time you drive on a straight highway, walk under a dome, or turn on a tap, you are interacting with a legacy of Roman practicality. Their world is gone, but its physical grammar, the vocabulary of arch, road, and conduit, is still used to write our own. This is the quiet, astonishing truth of the fall. The political entity called the Roman Empire dissolved, but its civilization did not so much end as it dissolved into the substrate of the West, like a rich mineral deposit slowly feeding the soil. Its laws organized our societies, its language shaped our thoughts, and its stones framed our landscapes. The empire fell, but its tools, its words, and its dreams were simply passed on, waiting for new hands to build upon them. For 2 centuries, one man's voice has echoed more clearly than any other in our understanding of Rome's end. His name was Edward Gibbon, an English historian of the 18th century, and his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, did more than record events. It gave the fall a mood, a moral, and a mournful, elegant rhythm that still shapes how we picture it today. Gibbon sat amidst the rational, ordered salons of the Enlightenment, an age that prized reason and civic duty above all, and he looked back at the ancient world through that very specific lens. What he saw was not a simple collapse from military defeat or economic strain, but a profound and tragic loss of spirit. His central argument was that Rome fell from within long before any barbarian breached its gates. The primary culprits, in his view, were 2 intertwined forces: the rise of Christianity and the relentless pressure of barbarism. He saw Christianity as a quiet, revolutionary solvent that ate away at the classical foundations of Roman society. Remember that old Roman ideal of virtus, the civic virtue that called men to serve the state, to debate in the forum, and to find glory in public life. Gibbon argued that Christianity redirected that energy inward toward prayer, asceticism, and the salvation of the individual soul. The finest minds, who might have been statesmen or generals, became bishops and monks. Citizens, taught to focus on a heavenly kingdom, grew less invested in the fate of their earthly city. The classical virtues of courage, patriotism, and civic pride were, in his view, softened by the Christian virtues of humility, piety, and pacifism. This made the empire psychologically less capable of defending itself. At the same time, Gibbon pointed to what he called the barbarism of the Germans, the constant, grinding pressure from northern tribes that slowly overwhelmed the frontiers not just with soldiers, but with their own customs and lack of discipline. He saw the Roman military's reliance on these very tribes as a fatal contamination, a mixing of a refined, complex civilization with a crude, martial culture that ultimately could not sustain the delicate machinery of state. Gibbon's genius, however, lay not just in his thesis but in his tone. He wrote with a stately, elegiac prose, a rolling, somber music that perfectly suited his subject. Reading Gibbon feels like walking through a grand, abandoned palace at dusk, every sentence a sigh for lost grandeur. He described the fall not as a violent crash, but as a long, slow, inevitable decay, the gentle rotting of a mighty oak from the inside out. This vision was immensely powerful. It framed the entire story as a profound tragedy, a cautionary tale about what happens when a great civilization loses its moral fiber and its will to persevere. For generations, his interpretation was the definitive one, painting the fall in shades of melancholy and moral lesson. It is a perspective that feels inherently suited to quiet, reflective narration, because it is less about battles and dates and more about the slow, silent fading of a light. Yet, as influential as Gibbon's mournful masterpiece remains, it is only one window into a room with many doors. Gibbon's elegant, mournful thesis cast a long shadow, but the modern study of Rome's fall is no longer a single-story building. It has become a sprawling, interdisciplinary city where archaeologists, climate scientists, economists, and historians all bring new evidence to the table. The consensus that emerges is humbling in its complexity. Rome did not fall for one reason, but for many, a perfect storm of pressures that converged over centuries, overwhelming the empire's ability to adapt. Think of it not as a tree rotting from a single disease, but as an ancient forest succumbing to a changing climate, invasive species, and a series of devastating wildfires all at once. One powerful line of modern inquiry points to the very environment the empire relied upon. Tree ring studies and ice core samples from Greenland reveal a period of significant climatic instability beginning in the 3rd century, with shifts toward a cooler, drier climate in some regions. For an agrarian empire dependent on predictable harvests, this was a silent crisis. Droughts in North Africa or frosts in Gaul could trigger local famines, reduce tax yields, and push desperate populations to migrate, adding to the pressure on the frontiers. The empire's own success may have contributed to its environmental strain. Deforestation to fuel the baths of Rome, to build its fleets, and to clear land for agriculture could have led to soil erosion and localized ecological damage, slowly degrading the productive base of its heartlands. Another theory, both intimate and insidious, points to a poison within the pipes. The Romans loved lead. They used it for plumbing, for cookware, for cosmetics, and as a sweetening agent in their wine. Modern analysis of Roman skeletal remains shows significantly higher levels of lead than in pre-Roman populations. While not likely a primary cause of collapse, chronic lead poisoning among the elite, who consumed the most wine and used the most leaden utensils, could have contributed to cognitive decline, infertility, and erratic leadership over generations. Imagine a ruling class slowly being sapped of its vigor and judgment, not by moral decay, but by an invisible toxin in their very cups. Political and military failures remain central, but modern historians see them less as moral failings and more as systemic traps. The empire's sheer size created a logistical nightmare. Messages could take months to travel from Britain to Syria, making centralized control a fantasy. By the time an emperor in Milan learned of a crisis on the Danube, it was often too late. This forced the devolution of power to local generals, which in turn fueled the cycle of civil war and usurpation. The military overstretch was not just about the length of the borders, but about the crippling cost. Maintaining the army consumed perhaps 70% of the entire state budget, a burden that forced ever higher taxes and currency debasement, which then strangled the economy that was supposed to pay for it all. It was a vicious circle with no exit, and then there is the role of sheer contingency, the wild card of history. The arrival of the Huns at a precise moment of Roman weakness was not inevitable. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the even more devastating plague of Justinian in the 6th were biological accidents of staggering consequence, depopulating provinces and shattering economies in ways no policy could fix. What if a different emperor had handled the Gothic refugees on the Danube with more wisdom and less corruption? What if the Huns had turned their attention elsewhere? These questions are not just speculation, they highlight how fragile complex systems are to random shocks. The fall of Rome, then, is no longer a simple morality tale about virtue lost. It is a profound case study in systemic resilience, or the lack thereof. It shows how a civilization can be simultaneously robust and brittle, able to withstand a single catastrophe but vulnerable to many hitting at once. The political structure cracked under constant strain, the economy seized up, the environment shifted, disease struck, and new peoples moved in, all while the center was trying to hold. No single factor was fatal on its own, but together they formed a constellation of failure. This multifaceted view does not diminish the story, it deepens its haunting relevance. It asks us to consider how our own complex, interconnected world might weather its own gathering storms, a quiet echo from the past that feels less like a funeral dirge and more like a thoughtful, urgent whisper. The silent departure of an empire leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves a persistent question hanging in the quiet air. what, if anything, does the slow unraveling of Rome have to say to us today in our own complex and interconnected age? The temptation is to search for direct parallels, to cast modern nations in the role of a new Rome, but history is not a blueprint. It offers no simple checklist of warnings. Instead, Rome's long farewell serves as a profound metaphor, a meditation on the universal challenges that face any large, enduring human creation. It speaks to the inherent difficulty of sustaining vast institutions over centuries. The Roman state, in its maturity, faced a problem of sheer scale, a logistical and administrative weight that eventually grew too heavy for its foundations to bear. Communication lag, bureaucratic inertia, and the sheer cost of maintaining unity across diverse lands all created a kind of institutional fatigue. In our globalized world, where information travels at the speed of light but consensus can move with glacial slowness, we might recognize a distant echo of that same tension between connection and control, between the local and the universal. Another theme is the eternal balance between openness and security. Rome's initial strength lay in its astonishing ability to absorb, to integrate conquered peoples and ideas, turning them into Romans. Yet, in its later centuries, that very openness became a vulnerability, as the distinction between defender and defended blurred beyond recognition. The empire outsourced its own protection, and in doing so, lost a piece of its soul. Every society grapples with a version of this dilemma: how to be both welcoming and resilient, how to benefit from the flow of people and ideas without eroding the shared bonds that hold a community together. Rome's story suggests there is no permanent answer, only a constant, careful recalibration. Perhaps the most gentle lesson is about time itself and the quiet corrosion it works on all things. Rome did not fall from a single dramatic blow, but from 1,000 small wearinesses, political, economic, and spiritual. It was the slow leak, not the burst pipe. This is a reminder that the greatest threats to complex systems are often not the loud and obvious ones, but the incremental, the overlooked, the slow drift away from founding principles. It is the gradual hardening of arteries in a body politic, the unnoticed shift in priorities from public good to private comfort, the slow forgetting of what once made a civilization cohere. To study Rome's fall is not to predict our own, but to cultivate a certain kind of attention, an awareness of the long rhythms and the subtle stresses. It invites us to listen for the faint creaks in our own institutions, to value the mundane health of civic life, and to remember that no human creation, however magnificent, is granted permanence. The empire's true legacy may be this quiet wisdom, a deep understanding that all things, even the mightiest, are part of a story much larger than themselves, a story with a beginning, a middle, and a gentle, inevitable closing of the chapter. From the golden peace of the Mediterranean to the final, fading echo of a chant in Hagia Sophia, we have drifted through more than 1,000 years of human history. This was not the story of a single battle or a dramatic, overnight collapse. It was the story of a slow unwinding, a civilization exhaling over centuries, its threads loosening one by one until the pattern itself dissolved. Political ambition strained against economic reality, new beliefs grew within old walls, and the quiet pressures of migration and environment reshaped the world in ways no emperor could control. The fall of Rome was not an event but a process, a transition so gradual that many who lived through its pivotal moments never knew they were witnessing an ending. There is a profound comfort in this long view, in the scale of centuries. It reminds us that the greatest tides of change move with a patience that dwarfs our own brief worries. The anxieties that feel so immediate to us, the rise and fall of our own days, are but gentle ripples on this vast, deep ocean of time. So let this long narrative, this gentle drift from zenith to twilight, settle your mind. Let the slow rhythm of empires rising and receding become a lullaby for your thoughts. Thank you for listening, for allowing this ancient story to accompany you toward rest. May your dreams be as peaceful as the quiet that finally settled over the Roman world, a deep and star-filled silence after a very long day. Sleep well.